Welcome back to the Duke's Revenge, where the coldest hearts burn the hottest, and where the men society has written off become the most dangerous players in the game. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you right now? Drop your city and your local time in the comments, whether you're wrapped in blankets in London at midnight, driving through empty Texas highways at sunset, or stealing a quiet moment in Melbourne before dawn. I want to know. Because tonight's story is for everyone who has ever been underestimated, everyone who has ever been dismissed, everyone who has ever sat in silence while cruel people laughed in their face and thought, just wait, your time is coming. Let me tell you something that history books don't emphasize enough. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, a man named Henry Paget, the Earl of Uxbridge, was riding beside the Duke of Wellington when a cannonball shattered his right leg. According to legend, he looked down at the mangled limb, said quite calmly, "By God, sir, I've lost my leg." Wellington glanced over and replied, "By God, sir, so you have." That man, one leg, as society would later call him, did not crawl into a corner and die. He had his leg amputated without anesthesia, was fitted with a revolutionary prosthetic that would bear his name, and went on to become one of the most powerful men in England. Field Marshal, Knight of the Garter, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, twice. He lived another 39 years, and every single one of them was a testament to the truth that society's judgment means nothing in the face of iron will. Lord Nelson commanded the British fleet at Trafalgar blind in one eye and missing his right arm. Lord Fitzroy Somerset lost his arm at Waterloo and went on to command armies. These men understood something that the glittering aristocrats in their ballrooms never could. Disability is not defeat. It is camouflage. It is armor. It is the last thing your enemies see before you. Destroy them. And tonight's story? Tonight's story is about a duke who understood that lesson better than anyone who came before him. A man who let the world believe he was broken, shattered, finished. A man confined to a wheelchair, dependent on servants, pitied by the very enemies who had tried to murder him. They called him the Crippled Duke. They whispered that his mind had shattered along with his body. They laughed behind their fans and congratulated themselves on their victory. They patted his shoulder like he was a child and spoke slowly, as if his ears had failed along with his legs. They had no idea he was watching, listening, planning, writing down every name, every slight, every moment of cruelty in a ledger that would one day come due. And on his wedding night, when his new bride expected nothing but duty from a broken man, he rose from that wheelchair, crossed the room on two steady legs, and whispered the words that would bring an empire of corruption crashing down. Now they'll all pay. Let me take you back to the spring of 1847, to a crumbling townhouse in Mayfair, where a young woman named Lavinia Sinclair was about to discover that the most dangerous predators are the ones who let you believe they can't hunt. The study smelled of old leather, stale tobacco, and her father's particular brand of cowardice. Lavinia stood before Baron Sinclair's desk, her hands clasped to hide their trembling, and watched him pour a third glass of brandy with fingers that shook worse than hers. "You cannot be serious," she said, her voice steady despite the ice spreading through her chest. "The Duke of Foxworth has made a formal offer." Her father still would not meet her eyes. He hadn't looked directly at her in months, not since the creditors had started coming, not since her brother had fled to the continent, not since the slow collapse of everything the Sinclair family had once been. £40,000 to settle all our debts. Your brother, freed from the threat of prison. The townhouse saved. Everything, Lavinia. everything solved with a single signature. The Duke of Foxworth. She tasted the name like poison on her tongue. The man they wheel through the park like an invalid. The man who hasn't spoken a coherent sentence in public for 5 years. The man they say screams in the night and throws things at his servants. That Duke of Foxworth? Rumors. Her father waved a dismissive hand, though his face had gone the color of old cheese. Idle gossip from people with nothing better to occupy their empty heads. Father. Lavinia stepped closer to the desk, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. They say he cannot walk. They say he cannot control his bodily functions. They say his mind broke along with his body when that Russian shell found him at Balaclava. Why would such a man want a wife? What possible use could he have for me? Baron Sinclair finally raised his eyes to meet hers, and what she saw there chilled her more than anything he had said. Not guilt, not shame. Relief. Pure, craven relief that someone else would be taking his problem off his hands. He wants a companion, I imagine. Someone to manage his household. Someone to wipe the drool from his chin and pretend he's still a man. Lavinia's voice cracked like a whip. Is that what you're selling me for, Father? 40,000 pounds to be nursemaid to a vegetable? Don't be crude, Lavinia. It's unbecoming. Unbecoming? She laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to cut glass. You're selling your daughter to a stranger in a wheelchair, and you're concerned about what's unbecoming. I am saving this family. Her father slammed his glass on the desk, sloshing brandy across the wood. Do you have any idea what will happen if I don't accept this offer? The house will be seized. Your brother will rot in debtor's prison. I will be ruined. Utterly, completely ruined. And you, he jabbed a finger toward her. You will become a governess, or worse, dependent on the charity of cousins who have made abundantly clear they want nothing to do with our disgrace. So my choices are marriage to a madman or poverty and shame. Those are the only choices we have left. Her father's voice dropped, taking on the wheedling tone she had come to despise. Lavinia, please. I know this isn't what you dreamed of. I know you hoped for. I hoped for nothing. The words came out flat and cold. I stopped hoping 3 years ago when Mother died, and you gambled away her jewelry to cover your losses. I stopped hoping when Edmund fled, rather than face the consequences of his actions. I stopped hoping when I realized that the men in my family would always choose their own comfort over my well-being. Her father flinched, as if she'd struck him. Good. Let him feel something for once. The Duke has requested that you attend the Pemberton ball tomorrow evening, he said, his voice subdued. He wishes to meet you before any formal announcement. His man of business delivered this. He pushed a letter across the desk, heavy cream paper, sealed with dark wax, bearing an unfamiliar crest. A raven clutching a sword in its talons. Lavinia took the letter, feeling the weight of it in her hands, the weight of her future, the weight of chains she had not chosen but would be forced to wear. And if I refuse? Her father said nothing. He didn't need to. The answer was written in the bare patches on the walls where paintings had been sold to pay his debts, written in the threadbare carpet beneath her feet, written in the single candle burning where once there had been dozens. I understand, Lavinia said quietly. I will attend the ball. She turned and walked out of the study with her spine straight and her head high, because if she was to be sold like livestock, she would at least maintain her dignity. She would not give her father the satisfaction of seeing her break. But in the privacy of her chamber, with the door locked and the curtains drawn against the gray London afternoon, she allowed herself to weep. And as she wept, she made herself a promise. Someday, Somehow, she would make them all pay. Her father for his cowardice, her brother for his selfishness. The society that had watched the Sinclair family fall and done nothing but whisper behind their fans. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but she would find a way. Little did she know that the man in the wheelchair was making the exact same promise. The Pemberton ball was a crush of silk and scandal. The cream of London society packed into a ballroom that glittered with the light of 1,000 candles. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow fragments across the crowd. The orchestra played something sweet and forgettable. And everywhere, in every corner, behind every fan, and every cluster of expensively dressed bodies, the whispers flowed like poison. Lavinia moved through the crowd like a ghost, acutely aware of the eyes that followed her and the conversations that died as she approached. That's the Sinclair girl. Hasn't her father lost everything? I heard her brother fled to avoid debtor's prison. Gambling debts, they say, and other things. Poor creature. She used to be quite pretty, but desperation ages a woman so terribly. I wonder if she's here looking for a husband, as if anyone would have her now. She kept her expression serene, her borrowed fan moving in the precise rhythm her mother had taught her years ago. Show nothing. Feel nothing. Survive. These people were vultures, every one of them, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her bleed. She positioned herself near a towering arrangement of hothouse roses, close enough to observe the room, but far enough from the main clusters of gossips to avoid direct engagement. From here, she could watch the entrance and prepare herself for whatever was coming. She didn't have to wait long. The commotion began as a ripple near the main doors, heads turning, fans snapping open, conversations dying mid-syllable. The crowd parted like the Red Sea before Moses, creating a clear path from the entrance to the center of the ballroom. And through that path came the Duke of Foxworth. He was seated in a bath chair of gleaming mahogany and polished brass, propelled by a liveried servant whose face betrayed no expression. The chair itself was a work of art, clearly custom-made, with wheels that turned silently on the polished floor and armrests carved with the same raven and sword motif from his seal. A woolen blanket covered his legs, hiding whatever remained of them from view. But it was the man in the chair who commanded every eye in the room. Lavinia had expected a withered invalid, wasted by years of illness and isolation. A drooling wreck of a man, barely conscious, wheeled out for display like a curiosity at a fair. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. The Duke of Foxworth was beautiful. Not handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too sharp for that, too predatory. High cheekbones that could cut glass, a jaw that spoke of stubbornness and barely contained fury. Dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble by an artist who specialized in fallen angels. His skin was pale, the pallor of a man who had not seen sunlight in years, but it only emphasized the dramatic planes and angles of his features. And his eyes. God, his eyes. Pale gray, the color of storm clouds over a winter sea. And burning. Absolutely burning. With an intelligence that seemed to see through every mask in the room. They swept the ballroom with cold assessment, cataloging faces, noting reactions, missing nothing. Those were not the eyes of a madman. Those were the eyes of a predator pretending to be prey. The crowd murmured as he passed, fans fluttering like startled birds. Good God, he's actually here. I thought he'd died. Look at him. They say he can't even feel anything below the waist. Such a waste. He was magnificent before balaclava. I danced with him once, you know. The waltz. Well, he won't be dancing anymore, will he? Poor broken thing. The Duke's gaze swept the room, and stopped when it found Lavinia. The impact of those gray eyes was like a physical blow. She felt it in her chest, in her stomach, in the sudden weakness of her knees. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other across the crowded ballroom, the noise and movement around them fading to nothing. He sees me, she thought. Really sees me. Not the scandal, not the desperation, not the borrowed gown. Me. Then the Duke raised one gloved hand and beckoned. The crowd turned as one to see who had caught the crippled Duke's attention, and Lavinia felt 100 pairs of eyes land upon her with renewed interest. The whispers intensified to a fever pitch. The Sinclair girl? He's beckoning the Sinclair girl? Well, I suppose beggars can't be choosers on either side. Oh, this is too delicious. Do you think he means to marry her? Lavinia had two choices: flee and confirm every suspicion about her desperation, or approach and face whatever fate the Duke had in store. She was done fleeing. She walked toward him, and the crowd parted for her as it had parted for him. She was aware of every step across that gleaming floor, aware of the whispers, the stares, the cruel amusement of people who had nothing better to do than watch others suffer. Her borrowed gown felt shabby. Her carefully arranged hair seemed plain, but she kept her chin high and her pace measured. She would not cower. Not for them. Not for anyone. She stopped before the wheelchair and curtsied, a perfect execution of form despite the chaos in her heart. Your Grace. Lady Lavinia. His voice was low and rich, perfectly clear, nothing like the slurred mumbling she had been led to expect. You are exactly as described. I wasn't aware I had been described at all, Your Grace. The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, quickly suppressed. Intelligent, proud, and unwilling to be patronized. My man of business has an excellent eye for character. Your man of business has been observing me? For 6 months, I required a wife with very specific qualities. You possess them all. Before Lavinia could respond, a booming voice interrupted them. Foxworth! Good God, man! Is that really you? A florid man in his 50s pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with drink and self-importance. Behind him trailed 2 others, a thin, cold-eyed aristocrat and a silver-haired man with the calculating expression of a snake. Lord Ashworth, the Earl of Manton, Sir Reginald Blackwood. Lavinia didn't know their names yet, but she noted how the Duke's expression flickered when he saw them, a flash of something dark and dangerous, immediately hidden behind a mask of vague pleasantness. Ashworth, the Duke said, and his voice had changed, softer now, slightly slurred. The voice of an invalid, not the sharp instrument she had heard moments before. How good to see you. We heard you'd finally emerged from your cave. Ashworth clapped a meaty hand on the Duke's shoulder, the gesture too familiar, too condescending. Marvelous to see you out and about, old boy. Simply marvelous. You're looking well, Foxworth, Manton added, his thin lips curving in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. All things considered. All things considered, the Duke repeated, his voice vague. And who is this lovely creature? Blackwood's cold gaze fixed on Lavinia, assessing her as one might assess a horse at auction. Surely not a romantic interest, Ashworth laughed, a loud, braying sound that drew attention from across the ballroom. A romantic interest. That's rich, Blackwood. That's very rich indeed. He leaned down toward the Duke, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. I hate to be indelicate, Foxworth, but we all know your equipment doesn't work anymore, eh? The shell saw to that. Nothing to be ashamed of. Fortune of war and all that. But let's not pretend you're in the market for a bride. The crowd around them tittered. Someone gasped. Someone else laughed behind their fan. Lavinia watched the Duke's face, waiting for anger, for shame, for any reaction at all. But he simply sat there, that vague smile fixed on his features, and nodded slowly. No, you're quite right, Ashworth. Quite right. The shell took rather a lot. His voice was dreamy, distant. I simply thought the young lady might like to see the gardens, with Marcus pushing the chair. Quite safe, quite proper. The gardens, at night. In that contraption, Ashworth roared with laughter again. Oh, Foxworth. Some things never change. You always did have an eye for beauty, even if you can't do anything about it anymore. Manton smirked. Blackwood's cold eyes glittered with amusement. And all around them, the cream of London society watched and whispered and laughed at the poor, broken Duke, who couldn't even defend himself against public humiliation. Lavinia felt something shift inside her chest, something hot and furious. Actually, she said, her voice cutting through the laughter like a blade, I would be delighted to see the gardens with His Grace. The company here has become rather tiresome. The laughter died. Ashworth's face went red. Manton's smirk faltered. I beg your pardon, Ashworth sputtered. You heard me, my lord. Lavinia smiled sweetly, the expression sharp enough to draw blood. I find the air in here rather stale. Too many people who mistake cruelty for wit. She turned to the Duke and placed her hand on his shoulder. Shall we, Your Grace? For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, she saw something flicker in those gray eyes. Not the vague confusion of an invalid. Something fierce, something grateful, something that looked almost like respect. Yes, he said, his voice still soft, but somehow warmer. Yes, I think we shall. The servant, Marcus, began to push the wheelchair toward the terrace doors, and Lavinia walked beside it, with her head high and her back straight, leaving Lord Ashworth and his companions sputtering in their wake. The terrace was cool and quiet, lit by colored lanterns that cast dancing shadows across the stone. The music from the ballroom faded to a distant murmur as Marcus positioned the wheelchair in a secluded corner overlooking the darkened gardens. Leave us, the Duke said. Your Grace. Did I stutter, Marcus? Leave us. Watch the doors. The servant bowed and withdrew, his footsteps fading into silence. For a long moment, neither Lavinia nor the Duke spoke. The night air was sweet with jasmine and possibility. That was brave, the Duke said finally. And stupid. You've made enemies of 3 powerful men. I've made enemies of 3 boors who were publicly humiliating a man in a wheelchair. Lavinia turned to face him fully. Whatever your condition, Your Grace, you deserve better than to be mocked by drunken fools at a ball. Do I? His voice was different now, sharper, clearer, the slur completely gone. You don't know me, Lady Lavinia. You don't know what I've done, what I'm capable of, what I'm planning. No, I don't. She held his gaze steadily. But I know cruelty when I see it. And I know I don't like standing by while it happens. Something changed in his expression, a softening, almost imperceptible. You defended a stranger against your own best interests. Ashworth is well connected. He could make your life very difficult. My life is already difficult, Your Grace. I don't see how it could get much worse. It can always get worse. The words held the weight of experience. Trust me on that. Silence stretched between them, filled with the distant strains of a waltz and the whisper of wind through the garden below. Lavinia studied the Duke's face, the sharp lines, the intelligent eyes, the mouth that seemed designed for either cruelty or passion. Why me? She asked finally. The real reason. Not the speech about specific qualities and business arrangements. Why did you choose me? He was quiet for a long moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice was low enough that she had to lean closer to hear. Because you have nothing left to lose. No family fortune to protect. No social position to maintain. No reason to betray me for money or power. Because you've already lost both. His eyes met hers, gray and fathomless. And because I saw you, 3 months ago, at your mother's grave. Lavinia went still. You were there? I was passing by in my carriage. The curtains were drawn, but I could see through the gap. You were alone. It was raining. And you stood there for an hour, in the rain, just standing. Not weeping. Not praying. Just bearing witness. I don't understand what that has to do with. It has everything to do with it. He leaned forward in his chair, and for a moment, she forgot that he was supposed to be an invalid. I recognized something in you that day. Something I see in myself. The ability to endure, to stand in the rain and refuse to break, no matter how long the storm lasts. His voice dropped even lower. I need a wife who can stand with me through a very long storm, Lady Lavinia. A wife who won't flinch when things get dark. A wife who can keep secrets and hold her nerve and smile at her enemies while plotting their destruction. Lavinia's heart was pounding. Destruction? Those men in the ballroom, Ashworth, Manton, Blackwood, they did this to me. He gestured at the wheelchair, at his covered legs. They conspired to kill my father and sent me to die on a Russian battlefield. When that failed, they spread rumors about my madness, isolated me from society, and waited for me to wither away in obscurity. That's monstrous. That's politics. His smile was cold. But they made one mistake. They assumed that a broken body meant a broken mind. They assumed that a man in a wheelchair couldn't fight back. The smile sharpened. They were wrong. You want revenge. I want justice. There's a difference. He held out his hand, palm up, an invitation. I want a partner, Lady Lavinia. Not a nursemaid, not a broodmare, not a decorative wife who smiles and nods while the men conduct business. A true partner who will help me destroy the men who tried to destroy me. And in return? In return, your family's debts will be cleared, your brother's freedom secured. You will be the Duchess of Foxworth, with all the wealth and power that entails. And when our enemies have fallen, his eyes held hers, you will have helped reshape the very fabric of English society. It was madness. It was impossible. It was the most alive she had felt in years. I have conditions, she heard herself say. Of course you do. I want to know everything. Every plan, every secret, every step of your revenge. If I'm to be your partner, I will be a true partner, not a pawn moved around the board. Acceptable. I want control of my own funds, an allowance that is mine to manage, not subject to your whims. Also acceptable. And I want. She hesitated, uncertain how to phrase the last condition. I want honesty. Whatever else exists between us, I want truth. No more masks, at least in private. Something flickered in his eyes, pain perhaps, or hope. That may be the hardest thing you've asked for. Can you give it? A long pause. The lantern light danced across his features, and for a moment, he looked almost vulnerable. A man beneath the mask, lonely and scarred and desperate for connection. I can try, he said finally. I've been pretending for so long. I'm not sure I remember who I really am. But for you, he took a breath. For you, I would like to find out. Lavinia looked at his outstretched hand, at the raven and sword ring on his finger, at the future he was offering. Dangerous, uncertain, but undeniably alive. She placed her hand in his. Then we have an agreement, Your Grace. Everett. His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. My name is Everett, and if we are to be partners, you should use it." "Everett." She tested the name, feeling how it fit in her mouth. "When is the wedding?" 3 weeks. I have a special license. The ceremony will be at my estate, private, with no one to witness but servants and solicitors." His thumb traced a circle on the back of her hand, sending shivers up her arm. "By the time London realizes what has happened, you will already be beyond their reach." "And then?" "And then," his smile was a knife in the darkness, "we begin." The engagement period passed in a strange blur of preparation and pretense. Lavinia saw Everett twice, once when he came to finalize the settlements with her father, staying in character as the vague, pitiable invalid, and once when he took her for a very public promenade through Hyde Park, playing the role of the harmless cripple to perfection. But between them, something was building. She felt it in the way his eyes found hers across crowded rooms, in the way his hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary, in the way his voice dropped, low and intimate, whenever they managed a moment of privacy. It came to a head during their promenade through Hyde Park. Marcus had wheeled Everett to a secluded spot beneath a weeping willow, its trailing branches creating a curtain of privacy from the strolling crowds. Lavinia sat on a nearby bench, ostensibly reading a book of poetry, while the invalid Duke rested in the dappled shade. "You're not reading that book," Everett observed quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "No." She closed the volume, not bothering to mark her place. "I'm thinking about tomorrow. The wedding. Our life after it. What it will be like to share a house with you, to see you without the performance." She met his eyes, and something electric passed between them. To know the real you. The real me is not as pleasant as this version. But his gaze was intense, searching her face as if memorizing every detail. The real me has been angry for 5 years, bitter, consumed by thoughts of revenge. I'm not sure you'll like him as much as you like the character I play. I think I'll like him better." She leaned closer, drawn by a force she couldn't name. "The character is charming, but he's not real. I want what's real, Everett, even if it's difficult." "Lavinia." His hand rose from the armrest, reaching toward her face, and stopped, inches from her cheek. "We shouldn't," he said roughly. "Not here. Not where anyone might see. The fiction must hold for one more day." "One more day," she agreed, but neither of them moved. The ortho space between his fingers and her skin seemed to crackle with unspent energy. "Tomorrow night," he breathed. "Tomorrow, there will be no more pretending. No more masks. Just us. Just us." She wanted to close that distance, to feel his hand on her face, his lips on hers. The wanting was a physical ache, sharp and desperate. But he was right. One more day. One more performance. She pulled back, and his hand fell to his lap. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the almost kiss hanging between them like a promise. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. Marcus returned to wheel the chair back to the path, and the moment shattered. But all the way home, Lavinia could still feel the ghost of his almost touch on her skin. It terrified her. It thrilled her. The day before the wedding, Lavinia paid one final visit to her father's townhouse. She found him in the study, surrounded by ledgers and papers, already spending the money that had not yet arrived. He looked up when she entered, his expression flickering between guilt and relief. "Lavinia, come to say goodbye, have you? Very proper. Very dutiful. I came to tell you something, Father." She did not sit, did not approach, simply stood in the doorway, looking at the man who had raised her and failed her in equal measure. "Oh? And what's that?" "I know about the Duke's father." Baron Sinclair went very still. I don't know what you mean. I've done my research. I know that Lord Ashworth and his friends were involved in something corrupt, something that the old Duke of Foxworth discovered, something that got him killed. Lavinia's voice was steady, cold, utterly controlled. And I know that you were there that night, at the card tables, that you saw Ashworth leave with the man who would later sabotage the Duke's horse, that you could have spoken up, could have saved a man's life, but you chose to stay silent because Ashworth forgave your debts in exchange for your discretion. Her father's face had gone gray. How could you possibly? I have my sources. She didn't. She had guessed, put together fragments of overheard conversations, glances exchanged between her father and Lord Ashworth, the strange coincidence of debts forgiven at just the right moment. But his reaction confirmed everything. You let an innocent man die to cover your gambling debts, and then you sold your daughter to his son without a shred of remorse. Lavinia, you don't understand. The pressures I was under, the things they threatened, I understand perfectly. She stepped forward, and he flinched back as if she were the threat. I understand that you are a coward and a conspirator, and that you have never, not once, put your family's welfare above your own appetites. I'm your father. You are a man who happened to sire me, nothing more. Lavinia reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper, a document she had prepared with Everett's help. This is a confession. Your account of what you witnessed the night the old Duke died. You will sign it. I will do no such thing. You will sign it, or I will tell my husband everything, and he will destroy you. She held his gaze, unflinching. The Duke is not the broken man you think he is, Father. He is not vague or confused or harmless. He is the most dangerous person I have ever met. And if he learns that you were complicit in his father's murder, even passively, he will take everything from you, not just your money, your reputation, your freedom, your life. Baron Sinclair's hands shook as he took the document. You would do this to your own father? You sold me to a stranger for £40,000. Lavinia's voice was ice. You forfeited the right to claim family loyalty the moment you treated me as a commodity. Sign the paper, Father, and pray that I never have reason to use it. He signed. Lavinia took the document, folded it carefully, and tucked it back into her reticule. She was at the door when her father's voice stopped her. Lavinia, will I ever see you again? She looked back at him, this weak, broken man who had once seemed so powerful, so in control of her fate. That depends entirely on how the next few months unfold. She smiled, and it was not a kind expression. Goodbye, Father. Do try to behave yourself. She walked out without looking back. The wedding took place on a gray Tuesday morning in the chapel at Foxworth Hall, a small, ancient building of honey-colored stone that had witnessed vain marriages for 300 years. Rain streaked the stained glass windows, and candles flickered in the drafty air. Lavinia wore pale blue silk. White seemed inappropriate for a business arrangement, Everett had written in the note that accompanied the gown, and carried a small bouquet of winter roses. Her only attendants were servants, Mrs. Pemberton, the formidable housekeeper, and 2 housemaids who watched the proceedings with barely concealed curiosity. Everett was wheeled to the altar by Marcus, his legs covered by the ever-present blanket, his face arranged in that vague, pleasant expression he showed to the world. The vicar, an elderly man who had clearly learned not to ask questions, conducted the service with brisk efficiency. I, Everett Nathaniel Vane, take thee, Lavinia Grace Sinclair. His voice was soft, slightly slurred, perfectly in character. But when he slid the ring onto her finger, a heavy gold band set with a single gray diamond, his hand was steady, and his eyes, meeting hers, were anything but vague. I, Lavinia Grace Sinclair, take thee, Everett Nathaniel Vane. Her voice was clear and strong. Let the servants wonder. Let them whisper. In a few hours, none of it would matter. I now pronounce you man and wife. Everett raised her hand to his lips and pressed a formal kiss to her knuckles. Welcome to Foxworth Hall, Your Grace, he murmured. I believe you will find it illuminating. The wedding breakfast was quiet, just the two of them in a small dining room overlooking the rain-drenched gardens. Everett remained in his chair, maintaining the fiction even here, where only servants could see. But his appetite was good, and his conversation, when the footman withdrew, was sharp and focused. Tonight, he said, everything changes. Tonight? Our wedding night. His eyes held hers across the table. I promised you honesty, Lavinia, truth without masks. Tonight, you will see exactly who you have married. Her heart stuttered. Should I be afraid? Perhaps. A ghost of a smile crossed his features. But I don't think you will be. You're not the type to frighten easily. The day passed slowly, filled with introductions to the household staff and tours of the estate. Lavinia played the role of the new Duchess, asking questions and memorizing names and pretending that her mind wasn't racing with anticipation. What would she find behind the mask? Who was the real Everett Vane? By the time evening fell and a maid escorted her to the Duchess's suite, her nerves were wound tight as violin strings. The rooms were beautiful. Silk wallpaper in cream and gold, a massive four-poster bed, a fireplace where flames crackled cheerfully against the autumn chill. But Lavinia barely noticed the luxury. She bathed, changed into a nightdress of white silk, and dismissed the maid. Then she sat before the fire and waited. The connecting door to the Duke's chambers remained closed. An hour passed. Then 2. The fire burned low, and doubt began to creep in. Perhaps she had misunderstood. Perhaps he truly was an invalid, and the intelligence she had seen in his eyes was wishful thinking. Perhaps footsteps. Not the creak of wheelchair wheels, not the shuffle of a servant's approach. Footsteps, slow, measured, deliberate, approaching the connecting door. The handle turned, the door opened, and the Duke of Foxworth walked into the room. Lavinia's legs went weak. She grabbed the arm of her chair, her mind refusing to process what her eyes were seeing. He was tall, taller than she had realized, his height hidden by the chair. Broad-shouldered and lean, moving with the controlled grace of a predator. He wore a dressing gown of deep burgundy silk, loosely belted at the waist, and his feet were bare against the carpet. His feet. Bare, functional, weight-bearing feet. You, her voice came out as a strangled whisper. You can walk. Yes. He stopped a few feet away, and she saw him now, as she had never seen him before. The mask stripped away, the performance ended, the real man revealed. I can walk, I can run, I can ride a horse, climb stairs, dance a waltz. I can do many things that society believes impossible for the poor, broken Duke of Foxworth. But the wheelchair, the doctors, everyone believes. Everyone believes what I want them to believe. He stepped closer, and she caught her breath at the sheer presence of him. Power and intensity, and 5 years of carefully banked fury. The injury was real, Lavinia. A Russian shell at Balaclava. It shattered my leg and nearly killed me. For the first year, I truly could not walk. The physicians told me I would never stand again. But you proved them wrong. I spent 2 years in agony, relearning how to use my leg. Exercises that left me screaming into my pillow. Failures and setbacks and pain beyond anything you can imagine. His voice was steady, but she saw the shadow of those memories in his eyes. And when I finally could stand, when I finally could walk without assistance, I made a choice. What choice? To let my enemies believe they had won. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, tilting her head up to meet his gaze. No one watches the cripple in the corner, Lavinia. No one guards their secrets around a man they pity. For 5 years, I have sat in that wheelchair and let them mock me, patronize me, congratulate themselves on their victory. I have gathered evidence, cultivated allies, and planned the destruction of every man who conspired to destroy me and my father. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, feather light. And tonight, on my wedding night, with my wife as my witness, the waiting finally ends. Lavinia's breath was coming fast and shallow. Everything she thought she knew had been upended in the space of 5 minutes. "The men at the ball," she said. "Ashworth, Manton, Blackwood, they're the ones. They murdered my father and tried to murder me. They conspired to defraud the War Office, skimming money meant for army supplies. My father discovered the scheme and threatened to expose them. So they had him killed." His jaw tightened. "And then they sent me to the Crimea, with orders designed to be a death sentence. The shell that took my leg was supposed to take my life. Your soldiers. Most of them weren't as lucky as I was." Pain flickered across his features. Old pain, deep and permanent. They died following orders that were meant to kill their commander. Good men, loyal men, sacrificed to cover up corruption and greed. Lavinia reached up and covered his hands with her own. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry. Be my partner." His eyes burned into hers. "I told you I wanted a witness. Now you know what you will witness. The systematic destruction of 3 of the most powerful men in England. It won't be quick or clean. There will be moments when you question my methods, perhaps even my sanity. But when it's over, justice will finally be served." "I'm with you," she said. "I already told you that. Until the end. Even now, knowing what I am, what I'm capable of, especially now." She rose from her chair, standing before him in her thin silk nightdress, her heart pounding. "You're not what I expected, Everett. You are more. And I find that I'm not afraid of you at all." "What are you afraid of?" "That I might be falling for you." The words escaped before she could stop them, and she saw his eyes widen with surprise. "Which is ridiculous, because we barely know each other. And this is supposed to be a business arrangement, and I should be thinking about revenge and justice, and all the very serious things we discussed." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was 5 years of suppressed passion. 5 years of pretending to be less than he was. 5 years of loneliness and fury and desperate hope. All of it poured into a single kiss that stole her breath and her reason and every rational thought in her head. When they finally broke apart, both gasping, his forehead rested against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the moment you defended me in that ballroom," he said roughly. "When you looked at Ashworth, like he was something you'd scraped off your shoe and told him he was tiresome. That was the moment you decided to kiss me. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just found a partner." His hand slid down to her waist, pulling her closer. "I had found something far more dangerous." "And what's that?" "Someone I might actually fall in love with." The words hung between them, heavy with possibility. "This was supposed to be a business arrangement," Lavinia whispered. It was. His lips brushed her jaw, her throat, the sensitive spot behind her ear. "Would you like to renegotiate the terms?" "Yes," her voice was breathless. "I believe I would." He lifted her in his arms, actually lifted her, as if she weighed nothing, as if his leg had never been injured at all, and carried her toward the massive four-poster bed. "Then let's discuss the new terms," he murmured against her skin. "In detail." What followed was an education in every sense of the word. The season of 1847 unfolded like a carefully choreographed war, with Lavinia and Everett moving through London's ballrooms as the most talked-about couple in England. For Crippled Duke and his mysterious bride. Everywhere they went, whispers followed. Every appearance generated new speculation, and through it all, they smiled and charmed and gathered information, building the case that would bring their enemies crashing down. At the Hartington Ball, their first major public appearance as husband and wife, Lavinia felt the weight of 100 stares as Marcus wheeled Everett through the crowd. She walked beside the chair with her hand on his shoulder, playing the role of devoted wife to a tragic invalid. But beneath her gloved fingers, she could feel the tension in his muscles, the coiled strength he was hiding, the predator waiting to strike. "Lady Foxworth!" A simpering voice, and suddenly Lady Manton was before them, a thin, anxious woman with the perpetually worried expression of someone married to a monster. "How lovely to see you again. And dear Lord Foxworth, of course. You're looking so well, considering everything." "Considering what? Lady Manton?" Lavinia's voice was sweet as poisoned honey. "Oh, you know." Lady Manton's eyes darted to the wheelchair, to Everett's covered legs, to his vacant smile. "The injury, the difficulties. It must be so hard for you both." "Not as hard as one might imagine," Lavinia smiled. "My husband is a remarkable man. His capabilities never cease to surprise me." Something flickered in Lady Manton's expression. Confusion, perhaps, at Lavinia's choice of words. But before she could respond, Lord Manton himself appeared at her elbow. "Foxworth." He nodded curtly at the wheelchair. "Duchess." His eyes lingered on Lavinia a moment too long. "I must say, you've made quite a splash in society. Everyone is talking about the Duke's miraculous bride." "Miraculous?" Lavinia raised an eyebrow. "Well, one does wonder what could motivate such a beautiful young woman to marry." He gestured vaguely at the chair. "Well, you know. I married my husband because he is the finest man I have ever met," Lavinia said coldly. "His character, his intelligence, his strength of will. The wheelchair is merely furniture, Lord Manton. It says nothing about the man who sits in it." Manton's smirk faltered. Behind him, she caught sight of Ashworth and Blackwood, watching the exchange with identical expressions of smug amusement. "Laugh now," she thought. "It won't last." As if reading her mind, Everett's hand found hers and squeezed. A brief pressure, there and gone. "Stay the course. We're almost there." They made their way through the ball, smiling and nodding and playing their parts. But as the evening wore on, Lavinia became aware of a new presence hovering at the edges of her vision. Viscount Ashmore, Lord Ashworth's nephew by marriage, had been watching her all night. Now, as the orchestra struck up a waltz and couples began to flow onto the dance floor, he approached. "Your Grace." He bowed with practiced elegance. "I wondered if I might beg the honor of a dance." He was beautiful, golden-haired and blue-eyed, with the kind of classic English features that painters loved. His smile was warm and charming, and if she had been a different woman in a different situation, she might have been tempted. But she caught the way his eyes flicked to Everett's wheelchair, the barely concealed condescension, the assumption that a woman married to an invalid must be desperate for real masculine attention. "I'm afraid my dance card is quite full this evening, Lord Ashmore." "Surely you can find one dance for a fellow sufferer." His smile widened, charming and predatory. "We're practically family now, after all. And I imagine you must grow tired of..." Another glance at the wheelchair. Of sitting on the sidelines while real men enjoy themselves. Before Lavinia could respond, a louder voice cut through the conversation. "Ashmore, leave the poor woman alone." Lord Blackwood had appeared, his cold eyes sweeping over the scene with calculated amusement. "Can't you see she's devoted to her husband? Such loyalty is touching, really. Pathetic, but touching." "I meant no offense," Ashmore began. "Of course you didn't. You never do." Blackwood turned to Everett, leaning down until their faces were level, a deliberate, humiliating gesture. "How are you this evening, Foxworth? Managing to follow the conversation? It must be difficult, processing so much stimulation after years of staring at the walls of your sick room." Everett's expression remained vague, pleasant, utterly vacant. "The music is very nice," he said softly. "The music? Yes. Very good, Foxworth. Very good indeed." Blackwood patted his shoulder, once, twice, 3 times, the gesture oozing condescension. "You know, I sometimes think about the man you used to be. Before balaclava. Before you became... this." He gestured at the wheelchair. "You were almost impressive once. Almost a worthy opponent. Now look at you." Manton had drifted over, drawn by the spectacle. "Careful, Blackwood. You'll upset him. Remember what the doctors said about overstimulation." Oh yes, the doctors. The ones who said his mind was as damaged as his legs. Blackwood smiled thinly. "Tell me, Foxworth, do you even remember who we are? Do you remember anything at all? Or is it all just fog and confusion in that broken head of yours?" Lavinia's hands were shaking with fury. She wanted to scream, to slap that smug smile off Blackwood's face, to tell them all exactly what kind of man sat in that wheelchair. But Everett's hand found hers and squeezed, once, briefly. Stay the course. Let them dig their own graves. "I remember some things," Everett said dreamily. "Faces. Names. I remember you were friends with my father." "Friends. Yes, we were great friends with your father." Blackwood exchanged a glance with Manton, a flash of shared satisfaction quickly hidden. "Such a tragedy. What happened to him?" "Such a terrible accident." "Accident," Everett repeated. "Yes, terrible. Well, we won't tire you any further." Blackwood straightened, smoothing his coat. "Do enjoy the ball, Foxworth, or whatever portion of it you're capable of understanding." He nodded to Lavinia. "Duchess, my compliments on your charitable nature." They moved away, laughing quietly amongst themselves, and Lavinia watched them go with murder in her heart. "I'm going to destroy them," she whispered fiercely. "We're going to destroy them," Everett corrected, his voice still soft, but edged with steel. "And they're going to watch it happen, knowing they did this to themselves." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. She smiled sweetly at the Viscount. "I never sit on the sidelines, Lord Ashmore, and my husband requires my attention at all times. But do enjoy the waltz. I'm sure there are any number of young ladies who would be thrilled to partner with you." She placed her hand on Everett's shoulder and nodded to Marcus. They moved away, leaving the Viscount standing, alone with his rejected invitation. In the carriage ride home, Everett was silent, but it was not a peaceful silence. She could feel the tension radiating from him, see the way his hands gripped the armrests of his traveling chair. The moment the townhouse door closed behind them, the moment they were alone, he rose. The transformation was instant. One moment, the vague invalid. The next, the predator in full force. "That simpering fool," he growled, pacing across the entrance hall with the restless energy of a caged tiger. "Looking at you like you were a prize to be claimed, like I wouldn't notice, like I was too broken to care. Everett, do you know what I wanted to do?" He stopped before her, his eyes blazing. I wanted to rise from that chair and wrap my hands around his throat. I wanted to show him exactly how functional I am. I wanted— He broke off, jaw clenched. What did you want? To make it absolutely clear that you are mine. His voice dropped to a dangerous purr. That you will never be his or anyone else's, because you belong to me, and I will destroy any man who tries to take you from me. The possessiveness in his voice should have alarmed her. Instead, it sent heat flooding through her veins. I'm not going anywhere, she said softly. I chose you, Everett, the real you, not the performance, and no golden-haired Viscount is going to change that. Promise me. I promise. He kissed her then, hard and hungry and desperate, backing her against the wall of the entrance hall, where any passing servant might see. Upstairs, she gasped when they finally broke apart. Now! He lifted her in his arms and carried her up the stairs 2 at a time, proving beyond any doubt that his legs were more than capable of carrying them both. They didn't make it to the bedroom. The first blow fell in June, at the Ashworth family's annual summer ball. Lord Ashworth arrived at the festivities in high spirits, unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. He laughed, he drank, he patronized the Duke of Foxworth when their paths crossed, the same performance he had been giving for 5 years. Enjoying the evening, old boy? He clapped a meaty hand on Everett's shoulder, speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. So good of you to come out. Must be terribly boring, sitting at home in that chair all day. It has its compensations, Everett replied vaguely. Does it? Does it indeed? Ashworth laughed. Well, your little wife certainly seems to be enjoying herself. Quite the belle of the ball, isn't she? I'm sure all the gentlemen are lining up to dance with her. Shame you can't join them, eh? Yes, Everett said softly. A shame. Lavinia, standing nearby, watched the exchange with carefully hidden fury. Patience, she told herself. His time is coming. 2 hours later, Lord Ashworth was called away from the ball by an urgent message. His solicitor, the note said, had received correspondence that required his immediate attention. He returned 40 minutes later, his face gray, his hands shaking, his entire demeanor transformed. Within the hour, he had made his excuses and fled the ball, his own ball, leaving his confused wife to manage the remaining guests. The next morning, all of London knew that Lord Ashworth was ruined. His debts, £40,000 accumulated over 15 years of reckless gambling, had been called in simultaneously by a single creditor. He had 3 days to pay or face public exposure and bankruptcy. He could not pay. His estates were mortgaged. His wife's dowry was long gone. Every avenue of rescue had been quietly closed off, every potential ally warned away, every possibility of salvation systematically eliminated. On the 3rd day, Lord Ashworth locked himself in his study with a bottle of brandy and a pistol. They found his body the next morning. In his hand was a letter confessing everything: the fraud, the conspiracy, the murder of the old Duke of Foxworth. Whether he had written it voluntarily or under coercion, no one would ever know. Lavinia watched the news spread through London society like wildfire. She watched Lady Ashworth collapse at a morning call. She watched Charlotte Ashworth, that sweet, timid girl, weep as her father's crimes were exposed for all the world to see. She felt a flicker of guilt. Charlotte was innocent. Lady Ashworth had known nothing of her husband's schemes. They were victims, too, in their way. But when she thought of the soldiers who had died from fraudulent supplies, when she thought of Everett's father, murdered in cold blood, when she thought of Everett himself, sent to die on a Russian battlefield, while his enemies laughed and congratulated themselves, the guilt faded. "It's done," she said to Everett that evening, as they sat together in his study reviewing the news. "One down." "One down," he agreed. His expression was unreadable. "Two to go. Are you satisfied?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I thought I would be," he said finally. "I thought watching him fall would feel like victory. Instead," he shook his head, "I feel nothing. Just emptiness. He's gone. He can never hurt anyone again. Isn't that enough?" "I don't know." His gray eyes met hers. "Is justice supposed to feel like this?" Lavinia moved to sit beside him, taking his hand in hers. "Maybe the satisfaction comes later, when all three are gone. When the full truth is known. Maybe." He didn't sound convinced. "Or maybe revenge is simply hollow, no matter how justified. Then we don't do this for satisfaction." She squeezed his hand. "We do it because it's right. Because they need to be stopped. Because the soldiers who died deserve to have their story told." Something shifted in his expression. A softening, a release of tension she hadn't realized he was carrying. "How did you become so wise?" he asked quietly. "I had an excellent teacher." She smiled. "A man who refused to let tragedy destroy him, who spent 5 years planning not just for revenge, but for justice, who chose to build rather than simply destroy. I'm not sure I deserve such praise." "Then become the man who does." She lifted his hand to her lips. "We have 2 more enemies to defeat. Let's defeat them in a way that honors the people we lost." He pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you," he murmured. "I should have said it before now. I love you, Lavinia, more than I ever thought I could love anyone. I know." She held him tighter. "I love you too." They sat together in the firelight, 2 survivors of separate wars, and planned the next phase of their campaign. The second blow fell in July. The shipping company audit, accelerated by Everett's contacts in the accounting firm, had uncovered massive discrepancies in Manton's books. Supplies paid for, but never delivered. Contracts that existed only on paper. Profits siphoned into private accounts while soldiers abroad went without boots and medicine. The Times published the story on a Thursday morning. By Thursday evening, the Earl of Manton had been arrested. The trial was a sensation. Witnesses came forward in droves. Former soldiers, bereaved families, servants who had seen too much and stayed silent too long. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony damning, the verdict inevitable. Lord Manton was stripped of his titles and sentenced to 20 years in prison. He died there 6 years later, still insisting he had been wrongly accused. One remained. Sir Reginald Blackwood. He was the most dangerous of the 3, the coldest, the most calculating, the hardest to reach. His power came not from money, but from secrets. He knew things about half the lords in Parliament, and he used that knowledge to make himself untouchable, or so he believed. The valet came through, Everett reported one evening in August. The combination to Blackwood's safe. The letters are there. Every piece of blackmail he's used for the past 20 years. When do we move? Tonight. His eyes met hers with fierce anticipation. Tonight. We finish this. The Blackwood townhouse was dark when they arrived. Not in the ducal carriage, but in a hired hack that would attract no notice. Everett had left his wheelchair behind, moving through the shadows with the confident grace of a man who had spent 5 years pretending to be something he was not. They slipped through the unlocked side door. The valet had kept his word, and climbed the servants' staircase in silence. Lavinia's heart pounded in her ears. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like thunder. The study was exactly as described. Dark-paneled walls, heavy furniture, a portrait of Blackwood's father glowering down from above the fireplace, and behind the portrait, just as promised, a small safe set into the wall. Everett worked the combination with quick, sure movements. The lock clicked, open. Inside was a leather portfolio, thick with papers. "This is it," he breathed. "Everything. Every letter. Every secret. Every piece of leverage he's used to control half of Parliament. Take it all." He handed her the portfolio while he checked the safe for anything else. She tucked it under her arm, already imagining the headlines, the scandals, the reformation that would follow when these secrets finally came to light. "What have we here?" Light flooded the staircase. Blackwood stood at the bottom of the servants' stairs, a candle in one hand and a pistol in the other. Behind him, 2 footmen with clubs. His cold eyes moved from Lavinia to Everett, widening as he processed what he was seeing. "Foxworth." The name came out as a gasp. "But you can't walk." "Surprise," Everett said quietly. And then he moved. It happened almost too fast to follow. Everett was down the stairs in 3 bounds, his hand closing on Blackwood's wrist before the pistol could rise. A crack of bone. Blackwood screamed, and the gun skittered across the marble floor. The footman lunged forward, but Everett was already spinning, using Blackwood's body as a shield. His elbow caught one footman in the throat. His fist caught the other in the temple. Both went down, and suddenly it was just the 3 of them, Everett, Blackwood, and Lavinia, on the stairs with the portfolio clutched to her chest. 5 years, Everett said, his hand tight around Blackwood's broken wrist. 5 years I've waited for this moment. 5 years of pretending to be helpless, while you and your friends congratulated yourselves on your victory. It wasn't. I didn't. Blackwood was blubbering now, all his cold composure shattered by pain and shock. It was Ashworth's idea, and Manton. I just went along with them. You murdered my father. Everett's voice was ice. You signed the orders that sent me to die. You killed my men. And now you're telling me it wasn't your fault? Please, I have money. I can pay whatever you want. You have nothing that I want. Everett released him, and Blackwood crumpled to the floor, cradling his shattered wrist. Accept the truth, and I've already taken that. He nodded to Lavinia, who raised the leather portfolio for Blackwood to see. Your secrets, Sir Reginald. All of them. Tomorrow morning, they go to the Home Secretary, along with the evidence of your involvement in the War Office fraud and my father's murder. Everett stepped back, straightening his coat. You should have killed me when you had the chance. Now it's too late. They walked out into the night, leaving Sir Reginald Blackwood broken on his own marble floor. The stars were brilliant overhead, indifferent to the drama unfolding below. Lavinia breathed deep and felt something release in her chest, a tension she'd been carrying for months. It's over, she said. Almost. Everett took her hand. One more act to play. Sir Reginald Blackwood was arrested the following morning. His trial was the scandal of the decade. The letters from his safe were read aloud in court, exposing the secrets of dozens of powerful men. Lords resigned in disgrace. Ministers fled the country. The entire corrupt network that Blackwood had built over 20 years came crashing down around his ears. And through it all, he insisted he was innocent, that he had been framed, that the Duke of Foxworth, the Crippled Duke, the harmless invalid, had somehow orchestrated the whole thing. No one believed him. On a gray December morning, Sir Reginald Blackwood was led to the gallows at Newgate. Lavinia and Everett watched from a hired carriage across the square. They could have stayed home. They could have read about it in the papers like everyone else. But some things needed to be witnessed. The crowd was enormous. Thousands of people who had come to watch the end of a monster. They jeered and shouted and threw rotten vegetables as Blackwood was led up the wooden steps. He looked old, Lavinia thought. Old and broken and utterly defeated. His eyes swept the crowd, searching perhaps for a friendly face or for the enemies who had destroyed him. When his gaze found the carriage, found the 2 figures watching through the window, his expression twisted with hatred. Even now, at the very end, he knew. The hangman placed the noose around his neck. The priest said the final prayers. And then, with a crack of the trapdoor, it was over. Sir Reginald Blackwood was dead. Lavinia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Beside her, Everett was very still, his face unreadable. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. He was quiet for a long moment. "Empty," he said finally. I thought I would feel something. Triumph, maybe, or satisfaction. But there's just—" he shook his head. "Nothing. Maybe that's how it's supposed to feel." She took his hand. "Maybe justice isn't about satisfaction. Maybe it's about balance, about setting things right so we can move forward. And can we? Move forward. I think we have to try." She lifted his hand to her lips. "The men who hurt you are gone, Everett. All of them. The debt is paid. Now it's time to figure out who we are when we're not fighting." He turned to look at her, and something shifted in his expression, the hardness softening, the ice beginning to thaw. "I don't know who that person is," he admitted. "I've been at war for so long, first for survival, then for revenge. I don't know how to be anything else." "Then we'll learn together," she smiled. "I've never been a duchess in peacetime either. We can figure it out as we go." For the first time since Blackwood mounted the gallows, Everett smiled too. "Together," he said. "Together. Always." The carriage rolled away from Newgate, away from the cheering crowds and the swinging body, and the end of 5 years of patient, meticulous revenge. Behind them, a chapter was closing. Before them, a future was opening. Neither of them looked back. The Christmas ball at the Duchess of Devonshire's manor was the most anticipated event of the winter season, and the Duke and Duchess of Foxworth were the most anticipated guests. All of London knew what had happened. All of London had followed the trials and the scandals and the spectacular downfall of 3 of society's most powerful men. And all of London wanted to see the couple who had orchestrated it all. They did not disappoint. Everett was wheeled into the ballroom as he had been 100 times before. The familiar chair, the familiar blanket, the familiar expression of vague pleasantness. Lavinia walked beside him, radiant in a gown of midnight blue velvet, diamonds glittering at her throat. The crowd acknowledged them with barely concealed excitement. What would happen? What would the crippled Duke do? Had the rumors been true? Could he really walk after all? The orchestra struck up a waltz. Couples began to flow onto the dance floor. And Viscount Ashmore, still handsome, still charming, still convinced of his own irresistibility, approached the Duchess with a confident smile. "Your Grace, surely tonight you will honor me with a dance? Your husband cannot possibly object on such a festive occasion." Lavinia looked at him for a long moment. This man who had tried to seduce her from her husband. This man who had looked at Everett with condescension and pity. This man who represented everything that was shallow and cruel about the society they had just remade. "I'm afraid I must decline, Lord Ashmore." Her voice was clear enough to carry to the watching crowd. "You see, my husband has requested this dance." "Your husband?" Ashmore's smile faltered. "But he can't. Ladies and gentlemen." Everett's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade. It was strong and clear, nothing like the vague mumbling they had come to expect from the crippled Duke. The orchestra stumbled to a halt. Conversations died. Every eye in the ballroom turned to the wheelchair. Slowly, deliberately, Everett placed his hands on the armrests of his chair. The crowd watched, transfixed, as he shifted his weight forward. And then, he stood. The ballroom erupted in gasps. Someone screamed. Someone dropped a champagne glass, the crystal exploding on the marble floor. Ladies clutched each other's arms. Gentlemen stared with mouths agape. The Duke of Foxworth rose to his full height, 6 feet of coiled power and fierce intelligence, and stepped away from the wheelchair that had defined him for 5 years. He straightened his coat, adjusted his cuffs, and extended his hand to his wife. "I believe they're playing a waltz, Duchess." His voice carried across the stunned silence. "Dance with me." Lavinia took his hand, and together they walked onto the dance floor. The orchestra, catching up to the moment with admirable speed, resumed the waltz, and the Duke and Duchess of Foxworth began to dance. They moved together with perfect grace, his hand firm on her waist, hers resting on his shoulder, their eyes locked in shared triumph. Around them, the cream of London society stood frozen, their assumptions crashing down around their ears. He could walk. He could dance. He had been capable of both all along, which meant everything they thought they knew was wrong. Slowly, the shock began to transform. Someone started clapping, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. Others joined in. And then, like a wave building to a crest, thunderous applause filled the ballroom. The crippled Duke was not crippled, had never been as crippled as they believed, had been watching them all from his wheelchair, planning, scheming, waiting, and they had never suspected a thing. It was the greatest deception in the history of the ton, and they were witnessing its triumphant conclusion. "They're cheering for you," Lavinia murmured as they spun across the floor. "They're cheering for us," his gray eyes held hers. "This was never about me alone, Lavinia. Everything we achieved together. Partners. Partners." He pulled her closer as the waltz built to its crescendo. Now and always. The music swelled, the applause thundered, and the Duke and Duchess of Foxworth danced on, oblivious to everything but each other. They had won. 3 years later, on a soft spring morning, Lavinia stood in the nursery of Foxworth Hall and watched her husband cradle their newborn son. Thomas Everett Vane, future Duke of Foxworth, was 3 days old. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, and he had already proven himself capable of demanding attention at all hours of the day and night. "He has your lungs," Everett said wryly, as the baby let out another ear-splitting wail. "That's definitely inherited from the Sinclair side. And your impatience. He wants what he wants when he wants it." Lavinia crossed to join them, leaning against her husband's shoulder to gaze down at their son. "I suppose we'll have our hands full. I wouldn't have it any other way." The baby's cries subsided as Everett rocked him gently, replaced by soft, cooing sounds that melted both parents' hearts. Through the nursery window, they could see the gardens of Foxworth Hall, the same gardens where Lavinia had first begun to understand the man she had married. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked. "Ashworth, Manton, Blackwood." Everett was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "Sometimes. Not often anymore. They feel like ghosts, figures from another lifetime." "Any regrets?" "Only that it took so long, that I wasted 5 years in that wheelchair when I could have been." He shook his head. "But then, if I had acted sooner, I might never have met you. Everything that happened, the pain, the isolation, the endless waiting, it led me to you. So no regrets." The baby yawned enormously and closed, his eyes, tiny fists uncurling as sleep claimed him. Everett laid him gently in the cradle, then turned to pull Lavinia into his arms. "What happens now?" she asked, her head resting against his chest. "Now we live, raise our children, tend our estates, perhaps reform Parliament, if we're feeling ambitious." His lips brushed her hair. "The revenge is finished. The justice is served. What's left is simply life. And you're content with that? After everything?" "Content," He pulled back to look at her, his gray eyes soft with love. I am the happiest man in England, Lavinia. I have a wife who challenges me, a son who will carry our legacy, and a future unmarked by the shadows of the past. If that's not contentment, I don't know what is. She rose on her toes to kiss him, pouring all her love into the gesture. You've come a long way from the angry man in the wheelchair, she murmured. I had an excellent guide. He smiled. A real smile, open and unguarded. My wife, my partner, my most dangerous duchess. Dangerous? She raised an eyebrow. The most dangerous woman in England, and entirely, completely, irrevocably mine. He kissed her again, and Lavinia surrendered to it, to him, to their life together, to the future they had built from the ashes of the past. Outside the nursery window, spring was unfolding across the grounds of Foxworth Hall. The gardens were blooming, the sun was shining, and somewhere in London, the Tun was still telling the story of the Crippled Duke, the man who had fooled them all, who had brought down monsters from the confines of a wheelchair, who had risen when they expected him to fall. It would become legend. It would be passed down for generations. And at its heart would always be the same simple truth. Never underestimate a wounded man. Never pity someone who has not asked for your pity. And never, ever turn your back on a predator who has learned to hide in plain sight. The end. Dear listener, if this story found you today, perhaps it wasn't by chance. Perhaps you needed to hear that the world's judgment is not the final word. That those who underestimate you have given you the greatest gift of all, the element of surprise. That the people who mock you, who dismiss you, who write you off as finished, have no idea what you're capable of. Remember the Marquess of Anglesey, who lost his leg at Waterloo and went on to serve his country for another 39 years. Remember Lord Nelson, who commanded fleets with one eye and one arm. Remember every person throughout history who was told they were broken and proved the world spectacularly wrong. If you're listening to this in a moment of your own struggle, if you feel overlooked, underestimated, counted out, then let this be your reminder. Your story is not finished. The people who have dismissed you do not get to write your ending. Only you have that power. Rise when they expect you to fall. Thrive when they plan for you to wither. Love when they assume you will only know hate. And when the moment is right, when you've planned and prepared and positioned every piece on the board, stand up from your wheelchair, look your enemies in the eye, and show them exactly who they've been underestimating. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. And remember, the coldest hearts burn the hottest, but the strongest hearts burn the longest. Until next time, my darlings, stay powerful, stay patient, and never ever let them see you coming. This has been the Duke's Revenge. Sweet dreams.